focus here is to look at major civil rights organizations during the civil rights movement. At the end, you want to be able to define these terms, complete the AP source framework for any of the required sources. We're going to first begin with the big four, the NAACP, the SCLC, CORE, and SNCC. This was Philip Randolph's organization. We looked at him during World War II. SNCC, which would lead this particular protest, which was in the Eye on the Prize. The SCLC, which was King's organization. So these are the big four that we're primarily concerned with. And King would have his March on Washington after the Birmingham campaign. He would deliver his famous "I Have a Dream" speech. And we see A. Philip Randall, Bayard Rustin, as far as religious leaders, all organizing to march on Washington. We also addressed a couple of classes ago in the Iron Prize series, the Mississippi Freedom Summer Project, where they were trying to establish schools as far as voting registration is concerned, and the 3 activists who were killed, which was mentioned in the Eye on the Prize series. The civil rights movement would eventually lead to the passing of the Civil Rights Act, which is why they're having the demonstration, the March on Washington, to provide support for that particular piece of legislation. And then eventually the Voting Rights Act of 1965. So be able to apply any of the text from any of these 2 laws. Source 1, we're going to be looking at by King, and these are the questions you want to think about here. King references a bunch of historical events, and let's take a look at this source. So here he gives a pretty good indication of the historical events that have been going on. He mentions Dred Scott, the Negro is not a citizen. He mentions the evolution of the Klan, segregation. He brings up a bunch of historical events at this section of this source. And then we move on to the next page here. Circumstances made it necessary for the Negro to travel more. From the rural plantation, he migrated to the urban industrial community, possibly a reference to the Great Migration that we have talked about. So again, King is looking at the historical information for the first section of this particular source. But then he brings up some of the movements that took place in the 1920s, the 1930s, where the Negro decided to take a look at himself individually and as a group. He began to reevaluate himself. King brings up the determination of the Negro, argues that privileged groups rarely give up their privilege without strong resistance, which means he's going to advocate for some sort of change. There are 2 possible answers, and where he's going to go with this is violence. So you have a group experiencing oppression, and you have 2 potential outcomes. One is going to be violent, and the other one is going to be the methodology that King is advocating for, his nonviolent approach. King continues with his comparison of violent and nonviolent approaches. The attack is directed against forces of evil rather than against people who are caught in these forces. It is evil we are seeking to defeat, not the persons victimized by evil. So here he's giving some flexibility to the Southern way of thinking, the Southerners, and he's not holding them accountable. King continues to use historical references in this section. This in brief is the method of nonviolent resistance, which is the methodology that he is advocating for. So you have the nonviolent and you have the violent method, which is what King is arguing against. Violence is going to only get violence. As you push people back up against the wall, they're going to respond and possibly be in defense mode, and that's not something that he's advocating for. At the end of source 1, you want to think about these questions here. As we move on to another image, here we have John Lewis protesting segregated swimming pools, and the next source is going to be his. And the question here, how does Lewis focus on the negatives that are hindering his struggle? Let's take a look at the next source in the AP framework, which is this one here. And the difference is that Lewis definitely seems to be critical of some of the changes. For example, the voting section of this bill will not help the thousands of citizens who want to vote. It will not help the citizens of Mississippi. People have been forced to move where they have exercised their right to register to vote. What is in the bill that will protect the homeless and starving people of this nation? He continues, this bill will not protect young children and women from police dogs and fire hoses. He's referencing Birmingham in this particular section here. We are now involved in a serious revolution. The nation is still a place of cheap political leaders who build their careers on immoral compromise and ally themselves. So that's an interesting reference here. We did look at the politics of slavery. That was one of the themes that we looked at, how political leaders were not willing to risk their political careers to end slavery. And here he is, Lewis, addressing that same point. Continues on. We all recognize the fact that any radical social, political, economic changes are to take place in our society. The people, the masses, must bring them about. So he's definitely looking for not just racial equality, he's looking for all types of equality, social, political, and economic. Some would say all three of those are linked. Some possibly would not. Now we want to think about this question once again. How does Lewis focus on the negatives that are hindering his struggle? To recap, we looked at Philip A. Randolph, the individual who was organizing during World War II to have equitable pay for defense contracts, led a march on Washington, and eventually would play a key role in the Organization Corps, which we mentioned was part of the Freedom Rides, where they were challenging some of the mandates on the federal highway system. Some of the additional founders of the Organization Corps. As I mentioned before, here you have the Big Four, the NAACP, which address segregation through the courts, King's Organization of Nonviolence. Here we have CORE with the March on Washington, as well as the Freedom Summer, and then SNCC, who protested at Greensboro, another nonviolent approach. In the Eye on the Prize series, we looked at King at Birmingham. Birmingham was mentioned in the Lewis piece, where the police officers and the fire department targeted protesters as they were protesting to end segregation. And King would write in his letter from Birmingham jail, looking at the just versus unjust laws. And this section here, which I think connects to some of the issues that we are addressing, here he brings up the issue of extremists, and he's arguing that Martin Luther, Thomas Jefferson, some important figures in European history, who are also considered extremists. So his argument here is that if he's extreme, well, they were extreme as well. This is the part here that is definitely important because King is looking at oppressed people and is arguing that you're going to have some reaction, and some are going to adjust to segregation, some are going to profit. Now, how would one profit from segregation? If you have the only black restaurant in whatever town, your business depends on segregation. But he also brings up this group here that is concerned with bitterness and hatred. Timeline of events. We have Birmingham, the March on Washington. We have the 16th Street Baptist Church. And then, of course, we have Kennedy and King. Kennedy would be assassinated, and the Civil Rights Act would be passed under Lyndon Johnson, his vice president. We're ready to address the issue of domestic terrorism for the 18th Street Baptist Church. Those people who are trying to end segregation through violence, they are trying to intimidate or coerce the population, influence the government, and trying to affect the conduct of a government by mass destruction. When you blow up the 16th Street Baptist Church, you are guilty on all three counts. Civil Rights Act of 64, here are some of the texts, and it's starting to see some change. Any inn, hotel, motel, or establishment which provides lodging to transient guests other than an establishment located within a building. So you're starting to see, not just in voting, not seeing changes in public buildings and schools, but now we're starting to go to private institutions. You know, if you are owning a inn or a hotel, you could be required to follow the Civil Rights Act of 64, or you would be violating someone's rights and not following the legislation. The turbulent 60s, as we move into the beyond the midpoint of the 1960s, you start to see some violence emerge. The Newark riots, Malcolm X assassination, Medgar Evers assassination, the murder of Andrew Goodman, the three civil rights leaders who were trying to start the Freedom Summer, the LA riots, King's assassination, and some recap of some of the events that we have looked at. At the end of this class, you should be able to identify some of these terms that are here. And if you want to check your definitions, use this slide.